Sabine Corvell did not flinch when the bedroom door opened. She was already sitting on the edge of the bed, Zariah's bed, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of red wine balanced in her fingers, like she was waiting for a cab. Not staring down the pregnant wife of the man whose shirt was still half unbuttoned, 3 feet away from her. She looked at Zariah. Zariah looked at her, and Sabine said, calm as ice water, "You should sit down. You look like you might fall." If you have ever been told to sit down in your own home by the woman destroying it, then you already know what happened inside Zariah Monroe's chest in that moment. And if you've never felt that particular kind of cold, stay with me, because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't forget. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. The morning had started the same way every Tuesday morning started. Zariah Monroe woke up at 6:15, not because an alarm told her to. Because her body, 7 months into carrying a child, had developed its own schedule that had nothing to do with comfort or convenience. She got up in the dark, made herself a small breakfast she didn't particularly want, and sat at the kitchen island of their 42nd floor penthouse while the city of Chicago assembled itself below her, gray and indifferent in the November cold. Ji-taek was already gone. He was always already gone. She had married a man whose mornings began before she could catch them. And she had spent almost 2 years telling herself that was simply how it worked when you married someone whose life ran on a different frequency than yours. He had meetings she wasn't told about, calls that required him to step out of whatever room she was in, and a particular quality of silence around certain subjects that she had learned not to push against. Not because she was weak, because she had understood or believed she understood that the silence was protective. That there were things in his world that it was better she didn't have to carry. That morning, she packed her bag for the literacy center and left the penthouse at 8:30. She was 12 minutes down Lakeshore Drive when she noticed her phone was gone. Not lost, not misfiled in a different pocket, gone. The kind of gone that meant she had somewhere inside the apartment. She remembered setting it on the kitchen counter after she looked at the weather. She remembered moving her coffee cup. She did not remember picking the phone back up. She turned around. That was the whole story, right there. A forgotten phone, a U-turn on a Tuesday. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor took less than a minute. Zariah didn't call ahead. She didn't think to. The apartment was her home. She had a key. She was retrieving a phone she'd left on her own kitchen counter. And the only reason she was slightly annoyed was because turning around had cost her 45 minutes of a day that was already packed tighter than she preferred. She stepped off the elevator and heard it immediately. Laughter. Not the low, careful kind of sound a man makes when he's watching something on his phone. Not background noise leaking through a closed door. This was a woman's laughter, full and loose and completely at ease, coming from the direction of the bedroom. Zariah stood in the entryway. Her hand was still on the door handle. The rational part of her brain began constructing explanations at speed. Staff. Some kind of staff matter. A housekeeper, a property manager, a contractor, anyone with a legitimate reason to be in the apartment. Ji-taek sometimes handled business from home when the situation required it. There were people who moved through this space that she didn't always know about in advance. She stood there building that story for approximately 4 seconds. Then she walked toward the bedroom. The door was not fully closed. It had been left open perhaps 6 inches, the way doors sometimes fall when no one is paying attention to them, when no one thinks anyone else is coming back. She pushed it open. Ji-taek was standing near the window. His shirt was open at the collar, the first 3 buttons undone, the fabric slightly untucked on one side in a way that Zariah recognized. She had seen him look like that in the mornings, in the particular intimacy of a room where guards come down. Sabine Corvell was sitting on the edge of their bed. Zariah knew Sabine, not personally, but she knew the name, the face, the title. Executive aide. The woman Ji-taek's legitimate corporation had hired 18 months ago through a staffing firm that specialized in executive-level placements. Competent, she'd been told when she once asked. Very efficient. Zariah had seen her twice at company functions, and both times thought, briefly, that there was something about the way the woman tracked Ji-taek's location in a room. But she had filed that thought away as paranoia, as the kind of small jealousy she wasn't willing to give power to, and she had moved on. She wasn't filing anything away now. Sabine was holding a glass of red wine. In Zariah's bedroom, sitting on Zariah's bed, looking directly at Zariah with an expression that contained no panic, no shame, and no particular urgency. Ji-taek said her name. She didn't look at him. Not yet. Something in her was still focused on Sabine, on this woman's absolute stillness, on the fact that she had not stood up, had not set down the glass, had not moved at all. She just sat there and looked at Zariah like she was waiting for something. "You should sit down," Sabine said. "You look like you might fall." The room was completely quiet. Zariah heard Ji-taek exhale. Sabine turned the glass slightly in her hand and tilted her head a fraction to one side. "You must be exhausted," Sabine continued, her voice carrying that particular register of performed sympathy that is actually contempt moving slowly through silk. "All that work with those children. All that time you spend teaching them to sound out words." A small pause. "It's admirable, really. The kind of life that suits some women very well." Zariah understood what was happening. The words were not random. They had been selected. "It takes a particular kind of woman," Sabine went on, "to stand beside a man like Ji-taek. Not a better woman, just a different one. Someone who understands his world from the inside." "Sabine," Ji-taek's voice was sharp. "Stop," Sabine stopped. But the words were already inside the room, already inside Zariah. There is a thing that happens to a person in a moment of profound shock that movies never quite get right. It's not that time slows down. It's that a part of your mind separates from the situation and becomes very quiet and very practical, and that part of you starts doing small things while the rest of you catches up. Zariah walked to the kitchen counter. She picked up her phone. She walked to the elevator. Ji-taek came after her. She heard him crossing the living room, heard him say her name twice more, heard something in his voice that she would think about later. Not love exactly, but something adjacent to it, something fractured and urgent. He called her name again as the elevator doors were closing. She watched the gap between the doors narrow. His face was the last thing she saw before the doors shut. She stood inside the elevator and looked at the closed doors and said nothing, and felt nothing that she could name yet. What she felt was enormous and had no edges. It was the sensation of a floor disappearing under her feet, not the falling, but the moment just before, when the ground is already gone and your body hasn't registered it. The doors opened at the lobby. She walked outside. November in Chicago was doing what November in Chicago does. The wind came off the lake like it meant something personal, and the rain was the thin, miserable kind that doesn't fall so much as appear, everywhere at once, on your face and your coat and in your hair. Zariah stood on the sidewalk outside her own building and took one long breath of cold air. Then she got in her car and drove south. Zariah Monroe lived on a tree-lined block in the South Side that had been working class when their mother moved there and was now something more complicated, something caught between what it had been and what developers wanted it to become. The houses on her street still had their original front porches. Drusilla had lived in hers for 11 years and had made exactly the renovations she chose and refused every suggestion that she modernize the rest. Zariah and Drusilla had not spoken properly in 8 months. The break had been the kind that doesn't announce itself as a break, no single argument, no door slammed in a way that means something permanent. Just a series of conversations that got shorter and more careful until there was a silence where a relationship used to be. Drusilla had never approved of Ji-taek. She had said so clearly and without apology twice. Zariah had told her that the approval wasn't required. And then they had both retreated to their corners and waited for the other to blink first. Neither of them blinked. 8 months of silence. Zariah parked in front of Drusilla's house and sat in the car for a moment. She had not called ahead. She had driven here on pure instinct, the way you sometimes move toward the only thing that feels solid when everything else has gone fluid, and only now that she was sitting in front of the house did she think about what she was going to say. She didn't have anything to say. She got out of the car. The rain had thickened. She was already wet by the time she reached the porch steps. She could see the light behind Drusilla's front window, warm and yellow against the gray morning. She knocked. Drusilla opened the door, wearing the reading glasses she always pushed up on her forehead and a look on her face that shifted through 3 distinct emotions in about 2 seconds: surprise, assessment, and then something that closed down hard over both of them. She looked at her sister. Zariah was wet. She was 7 months pregnant. She was holding her phone in one hand like she'd forgotten. She was still gripping it. Drusilla did not say, "I warned you." She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything at all. She pushed the door open wider. And Zariah stepped inside. They sat in Drusilla's kitchen for a long time. Drusilla made coffee, then decided coffee wasn't appropriate given the pregnancy, and made tea instead without asking. She set it in front of Zariah and sat across the table and waited. Zariah told her. Not all of it at first. The broad outline. Came home for my phone. Woman in the bedroom. Said what she said. Drusilla listened with the particular stillness she had developed over 2 decades of family law, the ability to receive information without reacting to it in real time, to hold it quietly until she understood its full shape. When Zariah finished, there was a silence. Then Drusilla said, "Are you hurt? Physically?" "No." "The baby?" "Fine." Another pause. "Okay," Drusilla said. That was all. Just okay. Not a judgment. Not an opening to anything she'd been saving. Just acknowledgement that this was the situation, and they were going to deal with it. Zariah felt something loosen in her chest. She had expected the "told you so." She had braced for it. The entire drive over had prepared arguments in her head, had rehearsed the version of herself who would take it without flinching. And instead, her sister had said okay, and meant it the way you mean it, when you're someone who knows how to be present in a crisis. Not warmly, not softly. "But actually, I'm leaving him," Zariah said. Drusilla didn't react. "I know that," Zariah started. "You don't have to explain it," Drusilla said. "What do you need right now?" Zariah thought about that. "I need tonight. I need to not be alone tonight, and I need to think." "You have it," Drusilla said. That was that. Zariah slept in Drusilla's guest room that night, and didn't sleep at all. She lay in the dark with the city outside making its quiet, distant sounds, and the rain moving against the window, and she went back through 2 years of her marriage, the way you go through a drawer you haven't opened in a long time, carefully, holding things up to the light and looking at them differently. She had known Ji-taek was not a simple man. She had known before she married him that his legitimate businesses existed, alongside something she was not meant to examine closely. She had asked him once, directly, and he had told her directly, "I operate in spaces outside the law. I always have. I will not lie to you about what I am. But what I do will never touch you." She had believed him. She had believed that the men who sometimes stood near the elevator were simply security. She had believed the calls he took in other rooms were simply business. She had believed that the careful, contained quality of his love was simply the personality of a man who had learned early that the world was not safe. She had not believed it would ever be Sabine Corvell sitting on her bed in the middle of a Tuesday morning. She lay there and thought about Sabine's voice, the steadiness of it, the precision. It takes a particular kind of woman. She had known exactly which wound to press and exactly how hard, which meant she had known about Zariah in a depth that went beyond what an executive aide would naturally accumulate. She had known about the literacy center, about the community in which Zariah had built her life, about what mattered to her. The knowing felt deliberate. Zariah lay in the dark and pressed that feeling and didn't yet understand why it wouldn't flatten. Ji-taek called 11 times between 6 in the evening and midnight. She didn't answer. He did not show up at Drusilla's door, which she registered. It would have been his instinct to come in person. She knew him well enough to know that. The fact that he hadn't meant something. Either he was giving her space because he understood what she needed, or he was giving her space because someone had told him that showing up would make things worse. She wondered which. She turned her phone face down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling. The baby moved, small and insistent, shift of weight and pressure from the inside. Zariah put her hand flat against her stomach. "I know," she said softly to the darkness. She didn't know who she was apologizing to. Maybe the baby. Maybe herself. Maybe the version of herself that had gotten in that elevator 2 years ago, knowing what she was walking into, and done it anyway. Because the man in the apartment had looked at her once, across a crowded room, with an expression of such unguarded attention that she had thought, here is someone who will see me clearly. She had wanted to be seen. She had not wanted this. But here it was. By the morning she had made the decision that would redirect the next 18 months of her life. She was not going to react from pain. She was not going to be rushed into anything by emotion or by Ji-taek or by anyone else. She was going to move carefully. She was going to need Drusilla's expertise and probably someone else's, a divorce attorney who operated outside the sphere of people who owed Ji-taek anything. She was going to protect herself and her daughter with the same methodical precision that Ji-taek had used to protect everything he had ever cared about. She was going to learn how to be as strategic as the world she had married into. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that while she had been lying awake in Drusilla's guest room reconstructing the past 2 years, somewhere across the city, other people had already been moving. Someone had wanted her inside that bedroom. Someone had made sure her phone was waiting on that kitchen counter. And whatever she had stumbled into on a rainy Tuesday morning in November, it had very little to do with an affair, and almost everything to do with war. Zariah woke up at 5:40 in the morning, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes after a night of no real sleep, not the foggy, irritable kind of waking up, but the sharp, brittle alertness of a mind that never actually stopped working. She lay still for a moment and listened to Drusilla's house. The pipes, the refrigerator cycling, a car passing on the street outside, with its headlights sweeping across the ceiling. Then she sat up, put her feet on the floor, and started building her next move. Drusilla was already in the kitchen when Zariah came downstairs. Coffee on, laptop open, reading glasses down from her forehead for once, and actually on her face. She looked up when Zariah appeared in the doorway, but didn't make a production of it. "You sleep?" Drusilla asked. "Some. Eat something before we talk." "I'm not hungry. I didn't ask if you were hungry." Zariah sat down. Drusilla put a plate in front of her toast, eggs, nothing complicated, and poured her a glass of water, and then sat back across the table and folded her hands, and waited while Zariah ate 3 bites before pushing the plate aside. "I need a divorce attorney," Zariah said. "Not you." "Someone outside." Drusilla didn't blink. "I already made a call this morning." "Hollis Crane. He's handled 3 cases involving organized crime periphery, and he doesn't have any existing relationship with Ji-taek's companies. I've used him as co-counsel twice. He's careful, and he doesn't scare easy." Zariah looked at her. "You called him this morning?" "At 5:15, a beat. You assumed I'd made the decision." "I assumed you'd made the decision the moment you walked through my door last night," Drusilla said. "I've known you 31 years. You don't show up somewhere at 9 in the morning, soaking wet, unless you're already done." Zariah looked at the table. Something about being known that precisely not warmly, just accurately was its own kind of comfort. "Crane can meet us this afternoon," Drusilla said. "If you want." "Yes," Zariah said, "I want." Hollis Crane had an office on the 16th floor of a building in the Loop that managed to be expensive without looking like it was trying. The furniture was substantial, the view was real, and Crane himself was a heavy-set black man in his mid-50s who shook Zariah's hand with the kind of grip that meant he'd already decided to take this seriously before she opened her mouth. He listened to the outline without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 3 questions. Each one was specific, and each one landed in a place she hadn't yet thought to look. His assets. What do you have direct knowledge of versus what you've been told? Zariah thought. I've seen the property holdings. Some of the investment accounts. The legitimate side. How much access do you have to documentation? Some. Not everything. Does he know you're here? No. Crane made a note. Before we do anything else, I need you to understand the landscape. Your husband runs organizations that exist outside legal frameworks. Sepsigine. That doesn't automatically make a divorce more complicated. In some ways, it makes certain things cleaner because he'll be cautious about what he puts in front of a court. But it does mean that the negotiation environment isn't normal. He has resources that most opposing parties don't. And he has people. I know what he has, Zariah said. Crane studied her for a moment. Then you also know that any move we make needs to be airtight before it's visible. We don't file until we're ready. We don't approach him directly. We build the picture first. How long does that take? Weeks, maybe more. Zariah nodded. You're very calm, Crane said, not accusingly. Just observing. I'm not calm, Zariah said. I'm 7 months pregnant, and I'm planning to divorce a man who has more infrastructure than some governments. I'm just choosing how I look right now. Crane almost smiled. Fair enough. They were in the elevator on the way down when Zariah's phone rang. Ji-taek. She stared at it for 3 seconds. Drusilla watched her without saying anything. She answered. Zariah. His voice was controlled, but only barely. She knew what controlled barely sounded like in him, the slight compression of syllables, the breath before certain words. I'm here, she said. Where are you? That's not your question to ask right now. A pause. I need you to know, Ji-taek. She kept her voice even. I'm not having this conversation on the phone, and I'm not having it today. When I'm ready to talk, I'll tell you. Until then, I need you to respect that. Silence on the line. Is the baby okay? He asked. Something in her chest did something complicated. She pressed past it. Yes, the baby is fine, Zariah. I'll call you when I'm ready. She ended the call. The elevator doors opened at the lobby. Drusilla walked out first and Zariah followed, and neither of them said anything about the call until they were in Drusilla's car with the doors closed. He sounded scared, Zariah said. Good, Drusilla said, and started the engine. The next 10 days moved in a rhythm that was exhausting, in the way that purposeful, necessary things are exhausting. Zariah stayed at Drusilla's. She went to the literacy center 3 days a week because stopping would have required explaining why she stopped, and she wasn't ready to have that conversation with the people who worked for her. She sat across from Hollis Crane 4 times in those 10 days and answered questions that required her to inventory her own marriage like a crime scene. What she learned was not what she had expected to learn. Crane's investigator, a quiet woman named Patricia, who had 20 years of forensic accounting behind her and the demeanor of someone who found other people's financial disasters professionally interesting, will sound up 18 months of corporate risks connected to Ji-taek's legitimate holdings and laid them across the conference table in Crane's office. There's a trust, Patricia said, established 14 months ago. The beneficiary is listed under a placeholder designation, but the structure matches a minor child. Given your pregnancy timeline, that's almost certainly your daughter. Zariah stared at the documents. He set up a trust for the baby 14 months ago, she said slowly. Without telling me. Without telling you. Why? Patricia looked at Crane. Crane looked at Zariah with the expression of someone who is about to say something that requires the other person to be prepared. There's also this, he said, and slid a different document across the table. It was a security operations contract. She didn't recognize the company name on the letterhead, but she recognized the building addresses in the scope of work. Her building, her clinic, the literacy center on West 63rd. Dated 16 months ago. He had security contractors monitoring your locations, Crane said carefully, for at least the last year and a half. Possibly longer. We're still tracing the full scope. Zariah sat with that. He surrounded me with surveillance, she said. Protection is the framing he would use, Crane said. I didn't ask for protection. I didn't know it was. There her voice stayed flat. What's the difference between protecting someone and controlling what they're allowed to know about their own life? Nobody in the room answered that. She called Ji-taek that evening from Drusilla's back porch, standing in the cold with her coat pulled tight, because she needed air and she needed the discomfort to keep herself precise. He answered on the first ring. I need you to tell me about the trust, she said. A silence. Which trust, he said. But it wasn't a real question. Don't, Zariah said. Don't make me explain what I already know. Just talk to me. She heard him exhale, heard beneath that the particular quality of a man deciding how honest to be and arriving, this time at something closer to actual honesty than she'd expected. 14 months ago, I received a threat, he said. Against the child. Against you, but specifically against the child you were carrying. The Mokjin Circle, a rival network, sent a message that our heir would not survive infancy if I didn't withdraw from certain territories. Zariah said nothing. I took it seriously, Ji-taek continued. I structured a protected trust that couldn't be touched, regardless of what happened to me. And I put contractors in place around your regular locations, without telling you, because I knew you'd refuse if I asked. You knew I'd refuse, and you did it anyway. Yes. Because you decided what I was allowed to know. Because I was trying to protect. Ji-taek. Her voice was so quiet it was almost nothing. You decided what I was allowed to know about my own life. About the danger I was apparently already inside. You decided that for me. And then you called it love. The line was silent for a long moment. Yes, he said, that's what I did. She hadn't expected him to agree. The agreement landed somewhere painful. I'm still filing for divorce, she said. I know. I want the trust under independent oversight. I want security arrangements controlled by me, not by your people. I want full financial disclosure. Another pause. She was ready for resistance. For the apparatus of a man with vast resources and many options beginning to slow walk what she needed. Instead, Ji-taek said, You'll have everything you ask for. Zariah stood very still on the porch. The cold moved around her. No conditions, she said. No conditions. She didn't trust it. She wasn't supposed to trust it, but she filed it away and said goodnight and went back inside. Drusilla was at the kitchen table when Zariah came through the door. She looked up and read whatever was on Zariah's face with the efficiency of someone who had spent a career reading what people didn't say. He agreed, Zariah said. Drusilla put down her pen. To everything? Everything, I asked. Drusilla leaned back in her chair. That's not normal, she said. A man with his resources and his exposure, the instinct is always to slow things down, create friction, buy time. I know. Either he's genuinely trying to make this right, or he's agreeing now, so we drop our guard, and he controls the pace from the inside. I know that too. What's your read? Zariah thought about his voice on the line. The way he'd said yes when she asked him to confirm what he'd done. No deflection, no reframing. I think he's genuinely trying, she said. I also think that doesn't change what I'm doing. Drusilla nodded once. Crane files Monday. Zariah filed for divorce on a Monday morning in December, 22 days after she had come home for her phone. The news moved through Ji-taek's circle with the controlled efficiency of information in a tightly managed organization, which meant that within 48 hours, everyone who mattered knew, and within 72. The ripple effects began to surface in places Zariah hadn't anticipated. 3 of the literacy center's mid-sized donors paused their pledges without explanation. 2 of them called back the following day and restored the funding, citing a clerical error. The 3rd never called back at all. Zariah noted it. She noted the timing. She noted which pledge had come through a corporate entity connected, 2 steps removed, to a logistics company that appeared in Ji-taek's legitimate portfolio. She did not raise it with Crane, yet. She kept the information in the drawer, in her mind where she was storing things that didn't yet have full shapes. Then Sabine disappeared. Zariah found out from Crane, who found out from a contact in the Federal Organized Crime Unit, who had been maintaining a loose watch on Ji-taek's corporation as a matter of ongoing interest. Sabine Corvell had not reported for work on Thursday. Her apartment had been cleared, not ransacked, not abandoned in panic, but cleared with the deliberate efficiency of someone removing traces. Her phone went straight to voicemail. The staffing agency that had placed her received a resignation letter by email at 2 in the morning. Crane brought this to Zariah on a Friday afternoon and watched her face while he explained it. She ran, Zariah said. Or was removed, Crane said carefully. You think, Ji-taek? I don't think anything yet. I'm telling you the facts as they exist. Zariah sat with it. The woman who had sat on her bed with a glass of wine and told her that teaching children to read was a small life. Gone, as efficiently as she had arrived. What does the staffing agency say? That's the interesting part, Crane said. He turned a page in the folder in front of him and slid it across. The staffing firm that placed Sabine inside Ji-taek's corporation. We ran the ownership structure. Zariah looked at the document. The name at the end of the chain was Marek Veyron. She didn't recognize it. Crane explained who Marek Veyron was in the particular unhurried tone he used when the information was explosive, and he was trying not to detonate it faster than it needed to go. European-born financial strategist, primarily operated in gray markets. Known within certain federal investigation circles as the money architecture behind the Mokjin Circle's American operations. The rival network, the same network that had threatened Ji-taek's unborn child 14 months ago. Zariah read the page twice. Then she looked up at Crane. Sabine was placed inside Ji-taek's company by the organization that threatened my daughter, she said. That's what the ownership trail suggests, yes. And she ended up in my bedroom. Yes. The room was very quiet, which means the affair, Zariah said slowly, may not have been an accident. Crane spread his hands on the table. I want to be careful here. We don't know what Sabine knew or didn't know. We don't know whether Ji-taek was deceived or whether he knew who she was working for. We don't know the full picture. But someone planted her. Possibly, and she ended up in my bed. Crane said nothing. Zariah looked back at the document. Her jaw was tight. That doesn't change what he did, she said. She may have been placed there deliberately. He still let her in. No, Crane said quietly. It doesn't change that. She nodded. The nod was final, the kind that closes something rather than opens it. Keep digging, she said. She didn't tell Ji-taek what they'd found. She thought about it for 3 days and decided against it. Not out of strategy, or not only partly because telling him would have required having a conversation she wasn't ready for, one in which his response would complicate what she was still trying to keep clear in her own head. She had built a wall in her mind between two truths. On one side, Sabine Corvell may have been an operative. On the other, Ji-taek had still stood beside her in their bedroom with his shirt half open. Both things were true. She needed them to stay separate. The wall held mostly. It was the nights that were harder. She lay in Drusilla's guest room, and her mind went places she didn't want it to go. It went to what would have happened if she hadn't forgotten her phone. If she'd arrived at the literacy center and spent a normal Tuesday with the kids and come home that evening, and Ji-taek had been there and everything had been as it always was, quiet and contained, and she would never have known. A sound like green wood splitting. I'd have found out some other way later, and by then their daughter would have been born, and the entanglement would have been deeper, and the exit harder. She thought, maybe it was almost better that she found out this way. Then she caught herself thinking that, and pressed it flat. There was no almost better here. There was only what happened, and what came next. The federal investigators found Sabine Corvell 5 weeks after she disappeared. She was alive. She was in an isolated property outside Milwaukee, a property owned through 4 shell companies that eventually connected to Marek Veyron's network. She had not been there willingly. This information reached Zariah through Crane on a Thursday evening, and it changed everything again. Crane sat across from her in Drusilla's living room because by that point the three of them had established an informal war room in that house, and he told her what federal investigators had relayed. Sabine had been recruited originally to steal financial information. Schedules, internal communications, access codes. When the intelligence operation moved too slowly, Marek had given her a new instruction: seduce Ji-taek. She had refused. Marek had sent her photographs. Zariah looked at Crane when he said this part. Her sister, Crane said, and the sister's daughters. 3 and 6 years old. Zariah's hands were very still in her lap. The message was clear, Crane continued. Cooperate, or lose them. Zariah stared at the wall across the room for a long moment. She tried to end it, Crane said. According to what she's told investigators so far, she attempted to remove herself from Ji-taek's proximity multiple times over several months. Each attempt produced another threat. She was trapped, Zariah said. Yes, that doesn't mean Zariah stopped, reorganized. That explains her position. It doesn't explain everything she said in that bedroom. No, Crane said. It doesn't. He paused. There's more, he said. She looked at him. The afternoon you discovered them. Investigators believe it was engineered. Someone entered your apartment after you left that morning. Your phone, he stopped, chose the words carefully. Your phone was not left behind by accident. Evidence suggests it was moved. removed from your bag and left inside the penthouse deliberately. Zariah sat completely still. Someone moved my phone, she said. To ensure you would return. To ensure I would walk into that bedroom. Yes, she thought about that Tuesday morning. The 11-minute drive. The certainty she'd left it on the kitchen counter. The way it had not felt wrong, had not felt staged, had felt like exactly the kind of ordinary mistake anyone makes on an ordinary morning. Someone set me up to find them, she said. Her voice was even. Crane nodded. Which means, she said, and here something shifted in her tone that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was something that lived between both of them. That somebody in that building or connected to it knew my schedule well enough to time it. Knew the security codes. Knew when Ji-taek would be there. Crane held her gaze. Yes, he said, someone on the inside. Zariah looked at the window. Outside, Drusilla's street was dark and quiet, a few windows lit across the way, a city going about its ordinary evening, with no idea that in this living room, the entire architecture of a conspiracy was revealing itself one piece at a time. She had not forgotten her phone. She had been sent back for it. And whoever had sent her, whoever had placed that phone in her own apartment and timed her return like a stage direction scene, had known her life in the kind of detail that only came from proximity. Not from distance, from inside. Zariah sat in Drusilla's living room for a long time after Crane left. She didn't move to another room. She didn't make tea or turn on a lamp or do any of the small domestic things people do when they need their hands occupied. She just sat in the chair by the window with the city dark outside and her hands folded in her lap and thought about a phone. A phone that had been moved by someone who knew her schedule, her building codes, her habits, her routes. Someone who had access to the interior of her life with a precision that required more than observation from a distance. It required proximity, daily, ongoing, trusted proximity. Someone inside Ji-taek's organization had handed her marriage to his enemies on a Tuesday morning in November, and she had walked straight into it like it was her own idea. She pressed her fingers together hard enough to feel the pressure and thought, who? Crane came back the next morning with Patricia and a document case that was heavier than the ones he usually carried. He spread the contents across Drusilla's dining room table with the systematic calm of someone who had been up most of the night organizing what he was about to say. Zariah sat across from him. Drusilla stood near the wall with her arms crossed because Drusilla processed difficult information better on her feet. Patricia opened her laptop. Penthouse surveillance, Crane said. Federal investigators pulled the building's external camera archive going back 90 days. They found this. He turned his laptop to face Zariah. The footage was time-stamped. The afternoon of the Tuesday in question, the same Tuesday, 40 minutes after Zariah had left the building the first time. The lobby camera angled toward the secondary elevator bank. A woman, mid-30s, dark coat, hair pulled back, moving through the lobby with a key card and the unhurried confidence of someone who belongs. Her name is Evelina Rusk, Crane said. She entered the building using a service-level keycard at 2:14 p. She exited 17 minutes later. Zariah watched the footage. The woman moved like she'd been in that building before. Not tentative, not scanning for cameras, just walking. She's connected to Marek, Patricia said. We traced her through 3 employment contracts and a financial holding in the Caymans. She's been an operative in his network for at least 4 years. She moved the phone, Zariah said. We believe so. How did she get in? Crane paused. The keycard she used, he said. It was registered to a secondary staff access account, not one of the household staff. This account was created 8 months ago and assigned to a maintenance contractor that has never actually performed any work in the building. Zariah looked at him. Someone created a ghost access account, she said. Inside Ji-taek's building security. Yes. Who has the administrative access to do that? Another pause. The kind that meant the answer was already on the table, and Crane was giving her one more second before he said it. Building security is managed by Ji-taek's organization directly. Administrative access to the security system is held by 3 people. He turned another page. Ji-taek himself, his head of residential operations, and his chief of organizational security. Drusilla pushed off the wall. Who is the chief of organizational security? Crane looked at Zariah when he answered, because he understood instinctively that this was information she needed to receive, not information he should deliver to someone else in the room. Han Song-uk, he said. Ji-taek Senior Lieutenant. Zariah knew the name. Of course she knew the name. Sanuk had been at their wedding. He had stood near the back in a dark suit, and she had seen Ji-taek grip his shoulder when they passed each other and understood from that single gesture that this was someone who mattered. A man who had been inside Ji-taek's world since before she existed in it. She had met him perhaps a dozen times over 2 years. He was quiet, watchful, with the specific quality of stillness that she associated with people who spent their lives assessing rooms. He had always been courteous to her in the careful way that men in Ji-taek's circle were courteous, not warmly, but correctly. He had sent a gift when the pregnancy was announced. She remembered thinking it was a thoughtful choice. 16 years. Ji-taek had known this man for 16 years. Are you certain, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. The financial records are very clear, Patricia said. She turned her laptop screen toward Zariah again. Seong-uk received 3 transfers over 14 months. Routed through 2 intermediaries, the origin traces back to a financial entity inside Merrick's network. Zariah looked at the numbers on the screen. She thought about Seong-uk's gift for the baby. Something tasteful. She couldn't even remember what it was now. He knew everything, she said. He knew my schedule. He knew the security system. He knew when Ji-taek would be home. Yes, Crane said. He set me up. He provided the infrastructure that allowed Evelina Rusk to enter your apartment and stage the conditions for what you discovered. Zariah stood up from the table. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to the room. Outside December had settled over the street with its particular gray permanence, the kind of cold that stops pretending it's temporary. Nobody said anything behind her. She thought about the last 16 years from Ji-taek's perspective. 16 years of trusting a man who ate at your table, stood beside you at events, advised your decisions, knew the location of everything you loved. 16 years of building something with someone who was apparently willing to sell every piece of it. She turned back around. Ji-taek doesn't know, she said. It wasn't a question. Crane confirmed it anyway. Not yet. Federal investigators are still building the case. They've asked us to hold the information for 72 hours, while they complete the financial trace. 72 hours, Zariah repeated. Yes. She looked at Drusilla. Drusilla looked back with the expression that meant, this is your call, and I will back, whatever you decide. Fine, Zariah said. 72 hours, then we tell him. Those 72 hours were the longest of her life. She went to the Literacy Center on Thursday. Because she had a grant review meeting, she couldn't reschedule, and she sat in a circle of plastic chairs with her program coordinator and 2 board members and discussed reading assessment metrics for 4-year-olds. While somewhere across the city, a federal investigation was quietly assembling the proof that the man who had attended her wedding had been working to destroy her family for over a year. She functioned. She answered questions. She reviewed documents and made 2 decisions about curriculum that her coordinator later told her were exactly right. She did all of it with half her mind in that room and the other half in the place where the information lived, heavy and shapeless and waiting. On the drive back to Drusilla's, she found herself not because the roads were bad with both hands, but because it was the only way to keep the feeling of everything moving at once from getting out of her chest. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen at a red light. Ji-taek. She let it go to voicemail, then felt immediately that she'd made the wrong choice and called him back. He picked up in one ring. Are you all right? He asked. First thing. Always first thing lately. I'm fine. What do you need? A pause. I don't need anything. I called because I called. I know, he said. I know this isn't, I'm not trying to pressure you. I just needed to hear that you were all right. She sat at the red light and looked at the car in front of her and thought, he doesn't know. Right now, in this moment, he doesn't know what I know. He doesn't know that his lieutenant of 16 years has been feeding his enemies the coordinates of his family's life. The light changed. I'm all right, she said. And then, because it was true even if it was complicated, the baby's been moving a lot today. A silence, then quietly good. She hung up before it could become anything else. Marek Veyron arrived in Chicago on a Friday. Crane found out through his federal contact at noon, and he called Zariah immediately, and the way he said Zariah when she picked up told her before he said anything else that the situation had shifted. "He's here," Crane said. "Flew in this morning. We don't know where he's staying. The investigators are trying to track his location." "Why is he here?" Zariah asked. "Best theory at this point. Sabine is in federal custody. The evidence she's provided is substantial. Marek is either trying to contain the damage, or he's escalating because he thinks the operation is close to collapse." Escalating means what? We don't know yet. She pressed her hand flat against the kitchen counter. Does Ji-taek know Marek is here? We don't know that either. She thought for a moment. The 72 hours. "Up tonight at 8, Crane said. "Tell the investigators we're telling Ji-taek at 8:15, she said. "I want it coordinated." That evening, a car arrived at Drusilla's street that hadn't been there before. Drusilla's security consultant, a methodical woman named Rhea Maddox, who had been quietly managing a protection detail since the week Zariah arrived, noted it first. Dark SUV parked at the far end of the block, engine running. Plates registered to a rental company. The driver visible but still. Rhea flagged it to Drusilla without making a production of it. Drusilla told Zariah with equal calm. "How long?" Zariah asked. "Best estimate, about 2 hours," Rhea said. "So since the afternoon?" "Yes." Zariah looked at Drusilla. Neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, because saying it would have made the room feel smaller and there was still work to do. Zariah called Crane. Crane called his federal contact. The federal contact said, "Sit tight. We're aware of the vehicle. Do not move. Do not create a scene." Zariah sat tight. At 8:15, Crane connected her to Ji-taek on a three-way call. She told him what they knew. She didn't soften it. She gave him the facts in sequence. Evelina Rusk, the keycard, the ghost access account, the financial transfers, the name. Han Sang-uk. The silence that followed was the longest she'd heard from him. A sound like green wood splitting. It went on long enough that she would have thought the call had dropped if she hadn't been able to hear his breathing. "Ji-taek," she said. "I hear you," he said. His voice was completely flat. The kind of flat that isn't absence of feeling, but is feeling pressed down so hard it has nowhere to go. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, and hated that she meant it. "Where are you right now?" he asked. Not accusatory. Just needing coordinates. Drusilla's. "There's a car outside your street," he said. She straightened. "You know about the car. I've known about it for 4 hours. I've had 2 of my people watching it." A pause. "I didn't know if I was allowed to tell you." Zariah stood very still with the phone against her ear and absorbed the particular shape of that sentence. "I didn't know if I was allowed." A man who controlled a criminal empire, telling her he'd been waiting to see if he had permission to protect her. "What are your people reading?" she asked. "Marek's network. Low-level surveillance. Probably watching to see patterns of movement. Crane's federal contact says sit tight, I know." A beat. "I trust that advice more than I trust my own instincts right now." Which is not something I say often. Crane, still on the line, said, "That's the right call." Ji-taek made a sound that wasn't quite a response. Then, "Zariah, I need you to stay inside tonight. Don't go near the windows. I know how to handle a threat. I know you do." His voice shifted slightly, something underneath the flat giving way for just a second. "I know that. I'm asking anyway." She stayed inside. Sabine Corvell appeared at Drusilla's front door at 10:40 that night. Rhea saw her on the exterior camera first and came to get Zariah immediately. Zariah looked at the camera feed and saw a woman standing on the porch in a dark jacket, no bag, hair loose around her face, one hand raised to knock, and the other pressed flat against her own sternum, like she was trying to hold something in. "I want to hear what she has to say," Zariah said before Rhea could advise her otherwise. She could be, "I want to hear it." Rhea opened the door with her hand near her jacket, and her eyes doing the systematic work of assessing the street behind Sabine and the space around her and everything visible within 20 feet. She stepped back to let Sabine inside. Sabine looked at Zariah. Zariah looked at her. They stood in Drusilla's hallway under the overhead light, which was not a flattering light, which showed everything. The dark circles under Sabine's eyes, the way her jaw was set. Something in her posture that was not the woman from the bedroom, not that performed composure, not that deliberate cruelty. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally stopped pretending she wasn't. I have 2 years of documentation, Sabine said. Her voice was not smooth. Communications, photographs, financial records, Merrick's operational orders, and my complete written confession. I have it in a digital envelope that I'm prepared to send to federal investigators tonight. She held up her phone. I came to you first, she said, because you're owed an explanation, not a justification. An explanation. Zariah looked at the phone in Sabine's hand, then at Sabine's face. Talk, Zariah said. They sat in Drusilla's living room with Rhea standing near the door and Drusilla at the far end of the room saying nothing, just holding the temperature down by existing in it, and Sabine talked. She explained how she'd been recruited, how she'd believed initially that the financial intelligence work was corporate espionage gray, but survivable, the kind of gray that people in certain industries tell themselves is just how things work. How the directive had changed, how she had said no to Merrick's second instruction, clearly and in writing, and how Merrick had responded with the photographs. My sister's name is Céline, Sabine said. Her daughters are Noelle and Margot. She said the names carefully, like she was placing something fragile on a surface. I have not been able to speak to them directly in 14 months. Zariah said nothing. I tried to end it, Sabine continued. 3 times. The first time, Merrick's people followed Céline to her daughter's school. The second time they were inside her apartment building, within 24 hours. By the third attempt, I understood that there was no safe withdrawal. She looked at her hands. That Tuesday, she said. The afternoon you came home. I knew you were coming. One of Merrick's people had already been in your apartment. I knew what was going to happen. I couldn't stop it and I couldn't warn you. She paused. Merrick's people were listening to everything inside that bedroom. I had been told explicitly what to say to ensure you left immediately and didn't come back. Zariah's voice was very quiet. You were told to say what you said. Yes, about the literacy work, about what kind of woman I was. Yes, Zariah felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly, something wider than both. They'd been surveilling me, she said, for almost a year. They knew everything about you, what you cared about, where you felt most like yourself. Sabine's voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing her. Merrick told me exactly which wound to press. He knew it would work. Drusilla let a sound from the far end of the room. Not a word, just a sound that meant I am barely keeping myself inside this chair. Zariah stood up. She crossed to the window and looked at the street below. The dark SUV was still at the far end of the block, engine running, exactly where it had been. I understand what you've told me, Zariah said without turning around. I understand coercion. I understand that what happened to you was not simple. She turned around. I am not going to forgive you tonight, she said. I may not forgive you at all. Understanding what someone was forced to do and forgiving them for what they did are 2 different things. Sabine nodded. She looked like she had already known this was coming and had decided to come anyway. The evidence, Zariah said. Send it now, tonight. Sabine's thumb moved on her phone screen. 3 seconds later, she held it up. Sent. Then Rhea's radio crackled. Rhea's hand went to her jacket, and her voice dropped to the clipped register she used when something had changed. We have movement, she said. Multiple vehicles. East end of the block. Zariah moved to the window. 3 cars, moving without headlights in the direction of the house. Rhea was already talking into her radio. Drusilla was already on her feet. Sabine stood from the couch, and her face had gone the particular gray of someone who has been afraid for a long time, and just watched their last card play. They followed me, Sabine said. Her voice had lost its steadiness. We're moving, Rhea said. Now, back door through the alley vehicle at the end of the block. Single file. Do not stop. They moved through the kitchen fast. Zariah felt the cold hit her face as Rhea pushed the back door open and took point, scanning the alley in both directions with the methodical speed of someone trained for exactly this. Drusilla was right behind her, Zariah behind Drusilla, Sabine at the rear. The alley ran the length of the block. The vehicle Rhea's secondary, a dark SUV, engine running, was parked at the far end. They were 30 feet from it when the headlights came on. Not Rhea's vehicle, another one, blocking the exit, positioned sideways across the alley mouth, doors opening. Rhea stopped. A man stepped out of the blocking vehicle. Large, calm. The kind of calm that comes from being confident you have the superior position. He looked past Rhea directly at Sabine. "Give us the phone and the documentation," he said. And everyone walks away. Sabine raised her hand. She was already holding the phone up. "It's gone," she said, and her voice was shaking, but she kept it raised and kept talking. "It transmitted the moment I hit send. It's with federal investigators right now. If I disappear, copies distribute automatically. If anyone in this alley gets hurt, it distributes automatically. You have nothing left to take." The man looked at her. His jaw moved. From the other end of the alley, behind them, new headlights appeared. Then from the street, red and blue, the man beside the blocking vehicle looked left, looked right, looked at the federal vehicles closing from one direction and Ji-taek's people closing from the other, and made the calculation that took less than 2 seconds. He got back in the SUV. The vehicle reversed hard, clipped a dumpster, and fled down the adjacent street, directly into the path of 2 federal units that had been positioned there already. Rhea moved them to the main vehicle. Zariah got in, and Drusilla got in, and Sabine got in, and Rhea drove. She drove fast but not recklessly, the way professionals drive, always knowing exactly how much speed the situation requires. They reached the hospital on the north side 20 minutes later, not because anyone was hurt, but because it was the predetermined secure location Crane had arranged with federal coordination 3 hours earlier, when the SUV first appeared on Drusilla's street. Zariah sat in the back seat as the hospital's intake entrance lights came on the windshield, and she pressed both hands flat against her stomach, where the baby had been moving since they'd run through the kitchen. "I know," she said quietly. Drusilla heard her and turned around from the front seat. She looked at Zariah for a long moment, reading her face in the pale light. "You okay?" she asked. Zariah thought about Seong-uk. 16 years, a ghost key card. Her phone moved 3 feet from where she'd left it, so that her entire marriage could collapse on a Tuesday afternoon with maximum efficiency. She thought about what Sabine had said. They knew everything about you. What you cared about, where you felt most like yourself. She thought about Ji-taek sitting out Drusilla's house every night. She pressed her hands flat against where her daughter was moving and felt the movement steady and alive and entirely certain of its own momentum. "No," she said, "but I'm going to be." Inside the hospital entrance, a nurse was already moving toward them, and Zariah was opening the door, and Rhea was already on her radio saying we're at the location. And somewhere across the city, Ji-taek was receiving the same message and already moving, and none of them knew. Yet that by morning the situation would have changed again in a way that none of them had planned for, because Zariah's body had its own timeline, and it had decided that tonight was the night. Zariah was still in the intake bay when the second contraction hit. This one was different from the one in the alley, and different from the ones in Rhea's vehicle on the way over. Those had been the body announcing its intentions. This one was the body following through a tightening that started low and spread with the slow, something unstoppable authority of something that has been building for a long time and has finally decided it is done waiting. She breathed, counted. The nurse was already there, already asking questions in the calm, efficient gesture of someone who does this every night and means it every time. Drusilla answered most of them. Zariah focused on the ceiling. The ceiling was white, industrial, the kind of ceiling that has seen 1,000 rooms worth of human extremity and absorbed all of it without comment. She fixed her eyes on a point above her and breathed through the contraction, and on the other side of it heard herself exhale a sound that came from somewhere below language. "How far apart?" the nurse asked. 7 minutes, Drusilla said. "Maybe less now." The nurse nodded and moved, and the bay became the particular controlled urgency of a place where things happen on a timeline that no one fully controls. Rhea appeared at the curtain edge, said something brief and low to Drusilla, and disappeared again. Zariah caught the shape of it without the words. Federal units had secured the two men from the alley. The third vehicle had been intercepted on the adjacent street. Merrick's people had run directly into a position they hadn't known was waiting for them. She filed this information in the back of her mind, where the crisis information lived, and turned back to the ceiling and breathed. Drusilla took her hand. Zariah didn't look at her. She just held on. Ji-taek received the hospital address at 11:43. It was 4 blocks from Drusilla's street when his phone buzzed Drusilla's number, which he had called 11 times over the past 8 weeks and which had never answered, now calling him. He picked up in the first second. Drusilla's voice was clipped and factual, in the way of someone who has decided that information is what is needed and emotion is what can wait. We're at Northwestern Intake. Labor and delivery. She's asking for you. She had not said she was asking for him. But Drusilla had said it, and he was not going to examine whether it was entirely accurate, or whether Drusilla had made an executive decision about what he needed to hear, because none of that mattered. "I'm 9 minutes away," he said. "Make it 6, Drusilla said, and ended the call. He made it in 5. Sound and through the parking structure, because it was faster, the lower level fed directly to the elevator bank, and the elevator bank opened 40 feet from intake, and he knew the building's layout, because he had, in the past 8 weeks, had layouts of every building Zariah had any connection to, a habit he recognized as the same instinct that had surrounded her with contractors without her knowledge, the same instinct he was trying to dismantle in himself, one careful choice at a time, but which tonight he was not going to apologize for. He was through the parking structure doors and moving toward the elevator when he saw the 3 men. He recognized the posture before he recognized the faces. The specific way people stand when they are waiting for something they expect to walk to them wait forward. Hands loose, positioned at the angle that gives maximum reaction time to multiple approach vectors. He had stood that way himself. He had trained people to stand that way. He knew what it meant. They were between him and the elevator. The middle one spoke first, Mr. Kwon, calm, almost respectful. The kind of calm that means the alternative to calm has been pre-decided. "We just need a few minutes of your time." Ji-taek assessed the space and the time it took him to draw one breath. Underground parking structure. Low ceiling. 3 men spaced with professional intent. Security camera in the far corner, red light indicating it was active and recording. 2 other vehicles between him and them, which was cover and obstacle simultaneously. "That's not going to work for me tonight," Ji-taek said. He moved. Not away. Threw directly toward the middle man and slightly left, forcing the spacing apart before the other 2 could close it. Because the worst position in a 3-person setup is to let them triangulate, and the only way to prevent triangulation is to disrupt the geometry before it sets. The middle man was fast. He closed the gap and got a hand on Ji-taek's jacket collar, and Ji-taek let the grip happen because the grip meant the man's weight was committed, and a committed weight is a redirectable weight. He dropped his shoulder, turned under the grip, drove his elbow into the man's sternum with everything he had. The man went back into the car door behind him with a sound that was mostly impact. The second man came from the left. Ji-taek caught the movement in his peripheral vision too late to fully evade, but early enough to angle. The blade the man was carrying caught him below the left ribs, not deep but real, a line of fire that opened and registered, and he noted it and did not stop moving, because stopping was the end of this, and the end of this was not acceptable. He hit the second man with the heel of his palm under the jaw. The man's teeth came together audibly, and he staggered and went down on one knee. The third man was on his phone. Calling or recording it didn't matter which. Ji-taek left him. He crossed to the elevator and hit the button and stood with his left hand pressed flat against his side where the fire was. His fingers came away dark. The elevator opened. He got in. The door closed. He stood in the elevator and pressed his hand against his side and breathed steadily through his nose in the way you breathe when you need your body to believe things are more under control than they are. 3 floors. He could hear his own pulse. The door opened on labor and delivery. Zariah heard the change in the hallway before she saw him. She was in a proper room. Now they had moved her 20 minutes ago. A room with walls and a closing door and a window that looked out at the parking structure lights, and she was mid-contraction when the shift in the hallway noise happened. The particular displacement of air and attention when someone moves through a space with a quality of urgency. The door opened. Ji-taek was in the doorway. He was wearing a dark jacket, and he was holding the left side of it with his right hand, and there was blood on his hand and more of it soaking through the jacket fabric below his ribs. And Zariah looked at it and felt 2 things simultaneously, which was the baby pressing against her pelvis with unambiguous insistence, and a cold, specific fear that had nothing to do with herself. "What happened?" she said, flat and direct, because she did not have the bandwidth for anything else. "Parking structure," he said. "I'm fine. You're bleeding through your jacket." "It's not—" He stopped. He was looking at her on the table, at the monitor, at the IV line in the back of her hand, at Drusilla standing on the other side of the bed with an expression that was doing a great deal of work. And something moved across his face that she would think about later, in a quieter time. How far apart? 4 minutes. Ji-taek, what happened? He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the table. He moved deliberately, with the controlled precision of someone managing something they don't want the room to see, and when he sat down, she could see in the lines around his jaw that sitting down had been the right decision to make before his body made it for him. He put his right hand flat on the edge of the table. He did not reach for her hand. He was not sure whether he was allowed to. "Marek's people," he said. "They knew I'd come when Drusilla called." "How many?" 3. "You went through 3 of Marek's people in a parking structure." "I got to the elevator." Zariah looked at his hand on the table, at the dark stain still spreading slowly through the left side of his jacket, at the controlled stillness of a man who was managing pain with the same deliberate efficiency he managed everything. "You need someone to look at that," she said after. Ji tapped her. He said it without apology and without the aggression that the word could have carried. He said it like a fact about the order of things in this room on this particular night, delivered by someone who had made the decision before he got off the elevator and was not available to revisit it. The contraction arrived before she could answer. This one came with a different quality, not wider or more painful than the last ones, but more directional. Her body was doing something specific now. She turned away from Ji-taek and looked at the wall and breathed with everything she had, and Drusilla's hand found her left arm and held it. When it passed, she was breathing hard. She turned back. Ji-taek was watching her with an expression she had no name for. She had known this man for 3 years. She had never seen that expression on his face. It was not fear, exactly. It was the look of a person watching something they cannot intervene in, cannot manage, cannot route around or negotiate past or solve. The look of a man who has spent 20 years in rooms where his will determined outcomes, watching the one room in his life where his will was entirely irrelevant. "I'm okay," she said, though he hadn't asked. He nodded once. He still had not moved his hand from the edge of the table. The nurse came back and looked at Ji-taek's side with the professional assessment of someone who has learned to triage by look and told him, calmly, that he needed to go to the emergency department. He thanked her with genuine courtesy and did not move. She looked at Drusilla. Drusilla looked at Ji-taek. "He's not going to the emergency department," Drusilla said. Not defending it. Just translating the reality of the situation into language the nurse could work with. The nurse processed this for 3 seconds. Then she said she'd be back. And she came back 7 minutes later with a surgical tray and a second nurse and a set of instructions she delivered to Ji-taek with the careful clarity of someone who is going to do a thing under protest and intends to do it correctly despite the protest. She cleaned the wound while Ji-taek sat in the chair and kept his eyes on Zariah and did not make a sound that indicated he was feeling what the cleaning of a blade wound feels like. Zariah watched him not make that sound and thought about all the years he had spent not making sounds, not showing the cost of things, Fatson managing his own experience downward so that nobody in the room would know it existed. The nurse stitched. 11 stitches. Ji-taek sat with 11 stitches in his left side and his eyes on Zariah and said nothing until the nurse finished and moved away. Then Crane called Drusilla's phone. Drusilla stepped outside. The door closed. Zariah and Ji-taek were alone in the room for the first time since November. The monitor tracked the baby's heartbeat in its steady, rhythmic certainty. Zit. Zariah looked at the ceiling and then at the window, which showed all the parking structure lights below, and then at the man sitting in the chair beside her bed with his jacket still on and his right hand on the table between them. You were outside Drusilla's house. She's yes, he said. Every night, yes. She looked at the window. For how long? Since the night you left. The monitor kept its rhythm. She let the silence sit for a moment before she moved into it. You understand that's the same logic, she said. Different form. Same thing. I know. You decided I needed protecting and you did it without asking. Yes. His voice was level. And I'm not going to tell you it was right because it wasn't right. I'm telling you it's what I did. Don't agree with me to manage me, she said. That's also something you do. You give people what they need to hear so they stop pushing. His jaw moved. He looked at the table. You're right, he said. And when she started to respond, he continued, I'm not agreeing to manage you. I'm agreeing because I've had 8 weeks to sit in a car on your sister's street at 2 a.m. and go through the inventory of every wrong decision I've made in 3 years, and that one is near the top of the list. And I know it. And I'm not going to perform uncertainty I don't have. He paused. You ask me to actually understand it. That's me actually understanding it. Zariah looked at him. The contraction started. She turned away and breathed, and when it passed, she was sweating, and her hair was damp at her temples, and she did not care. What does it mean? She said when she could speak again. Going forward. What does understanding it mean going forward? He looked at her steadily. I'm done, he said. She waited. The organization. I'm done. I made the decision 3 weeks ago. He kept his voice even factual. Not for you. I need you to hear that clearly it's not for you. Because if it's for you, it becomes leverage, and I'm not doing leverage anymore. I'm done because I finally understood what I've been refusing to understand for 20 years. He paused. I cannot keep the thing that put a target on you and our daughter and tell myself it exists to protect you. That's a broken logic. It's been broken the whole time. Zariah looked at the ceiling. You're giving federal prosecutors everything, she said. Not a question. She could hear it in the structure of what he was saying. I've been in contact with investigators for 11 days, he said. I gave them the first batch of documentation 10 days ago. Financial records, internal accounts, operational architecture. Enough to take Merrick's network apart in ways it won't recover from. A beat. And enough to take mine apart too. She turned her head and looked at him. That exposes you, she said. Yes, they'll prosecute you. Yes. She stared at him. He held her eyes. I know what it costs, he said. I've thought about what it costs every day for 3 weeks, and I've decided the cost is what I owe. Not to you specifically. He stopped, looked for the word. To what's actually right, which is something I've avoided making decisions around for a very long time. Another contraction was building. She could feel it, in the way you can feel weather before it arrives, a change in pressure, a gathering. The divorce stands, she said. I know. Every condition I set. Yes. You're not telling me this as an argument. No, he said. I'm telling you because you asked what it means going forward. The contraction arrived and took over everything. Drusilla came back at 2:15. She came in with her coat still on and her phone in her hand, and the expression of someone who has received significant information and has organized it into the order in which it needs to be delivered. Sung-uk, she said. She looked at Ji-taek when she said it. Ji-taek looked back at her. Federal agents picked him up at O'Hare 90 minutes ago. He was attempting to board an international flight. The room was very quiet. Zariah watched Ji-taek receive this. She watched the information move through him with the particular quality of something hitting a place that was already damaged. His face did not change in any dramatic way. His jaw set slightly. The tendons in his forearms, visible below his rolled sleeve, went tight. He had known Seong-uk for 16 years, had built something with him, had stood beside him at his own wedding, had received from him, for 16 years, the particular form of loyalty that a powerful man depends on to operate not friendship exactly, but something that borrows the architecture of friendship and uses it for practical ends, and which becomes, over time, indistinguishable from the real thing, or which was supposed to be indistinguishable. Ji-taek looked at the window, at the parking structure lights. "The people in the garage tonight," he said. His voice was careful. "Did Seong-yuk know I'd come through the lower level?" Drusilla didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Ji-taek nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man filing something in a place from which it would never entirely leave. "Marek," Drusilla said, moving to the next thing, because she understood that sitting with the first thing too long in a room with a woman in active labor was not useful. Arrested at a hotel in River North at midnight, he was coordinating the alley operation remotely. Federal team traced the communications. Zariah looked at Ji-taek when Drusilla said this. He was still looking at the window. "The two men from the garage," Drusilla continued. "Federal agents secured them at the scene. The third was picked up on the adjacent street." Zariah pressed her hand flat against her stomach. The baby was moving. Had been moving with increasing insistence for the past hour. "It's over," Drusilla said, still not triumphant, just factual. The way she said everything that was important. Ji-taek brought his eyes back from the window. He looked at Zariah. "Seong-uk," Zariah said quietly. His expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to show the place where the information had landed. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "No, don't be," he said. "What he did is what he did. You trusted him for 16 years. And he made his own choices." The evenness in his voice was not the absence of feeling. It was the presence of a man pressing down very hard on something large. "I've spent my whole adult life deciding what other people should be protected from. I'm not going to start deciding what you're allowed to feel sorry for." Zariah looked at him. Something in her moved. She did not name it. Then the next contraction arrived, and it was a different animal entirely from everyone that had come before it, not worse in terms of pain, but different in terms of meaning. The body shifting from preparation to execution, from announcement to insistence, a wave that did not crest so much as take over everything from the inside out. She heard herself make a sound she had not made before. Not a word, something below and prior to words. She felt Drusilla's hand find hers and grip it, and she gripped back with everything she had, and when the contraction released him, she was breathing in the short, effortful rhythm of someone who has just run something. "That was different," the nurse said, already moving. "Yes," Zariah said. Ji-taek stood from the chair. He stood and looked at her in the center of everything, the lights, the monitor, the nurse moving with new efficiency, Drusilla holding her hand, and Zariah looked back at him between breaths. "Stay," she said. She had not planned to say it. She said it anyway. He stayed. At 3:48 in the morning, the attending physician arrived and assessed and said the word that changed the room's atmosphere from waiting to active. The team moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who have done this many times and know exactly which seconds matter. Zariah was beyond language by this point. Not unconscious, not absent present in the way you are most present when your body has taken over completely and left your mind only the job of staying in the room. She was sweat and breath and grip and the specific focused animal knowledge of what was happening and what was required. Drusilla held her left hand. The nurse held her right. Ji-taek stood at the far end of the room against the wall because she had told him he could stay, but she had not told him he could be in the center of it, and he understood the distinction and stood where he was placed. He stood with 11 stitches in his left side, and his jacket finally removed because a nurse had insisted, and he had complied, and he stood in his dark shirt with the left side of it discolored where the blood had dried, and he watched. Zariah was aware of him the way you are aware of a fixed point in a room that is moving. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the middle distance that people find when they are managing something enormous. But she knew he was there. She had told him to stay, and he had stayed. And she held that knowledge somewhere beneath the immediate physical fact of everything happening. And it was not comfort exact and not forgiveness, but something that shared a border with both. The physician said one more. Drusilla said, "You have this." Zariah breathed everything she had into that last specific moment, the one that has been building since November, since a forgotten phone, since an elevator closing on a man's face, since a woman's voice in a bedroom saying words that had been carefully selected to cause maximum damage, since a Tuesday morning that had never been a Tuesday morning, but had been a detonation disguised as an ordinary mistake. She breathed. She pushed. At 4:17 in the morning, Zariah Kwon came into the world. She announced herself with the full-throated, indignant authority of someone who has opinions about the conditions of her arrival and intends to make them known. The physician placed her on Zariah's chest, and Zariah felt the weight of her actual, physical, specific weight, the weight of a person who has been present but theoretical, and is now undeniably real, and pressed both hands around her and held. Zariah moved, protested with her entire body, gradually, incrementally, found something in the warmth and the heartbeat beneath her that registered as familiar, and began to settle. Zariah looked at her daughter's face. She had been told what this moment would be like by people who had experienced it, and she had listened, and none of what they had said was wrong, and none of it was sufficient. She held her daughter, and the room existed, somewhere peripheral and outside, and the only thing that was real was the weight in her arms, and the sound of Zariah breathing, both of them breathing, together, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and effort, and something else that has no name. The nurse said something. Drusilla said something. Zariah heard both from a significant internal distance. Then the physician looked up and across the room. "Dad," she said. "You can come closer." Zariah looked up. Ji-taek was still against the wall. His arms were at his sides. He was looking at Zariah with the expression she had seen forming when the baby's first sound had filled the room, not the sound she had expected to see on him, not the managed competence, not the focused assessment. Something that had no professional application. Something that was simply a man being undone by a moment that is designed to undo people. He crossed the room slowly. He came to the edge of the bed and stopped and looked at Zariah on Zariah's chest. "Her name is Zariah," Zariah said. He looked up at her. "Zariah Kwon," she said. "She keeps your name." His jaw moved. A muscle in his throat. He nodded. "Come closer," she said. He moved to the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter in the light. Her eyes closed, her fist pressed against Zariah's collarbone, her face folded in the expression of someone who has recently been through something and is taking stock. "I'm going to cooperate fully," he said. His voice was low. "Everything I said, every condition you set, and I'm not going to use any of it as an argument for anything with you." Zariah looked at him. What she needs is not the Kwon name, not money, not protection built from fear. She looked down at Zariah. She needs a father who shows up when he says he will. A silence. "I will," he said. She looked at him, the man who had decided what she was allowed to know, who had allowed an operative into their bed and had also sat outside her sister's house in the cold for 8 weeks, who had gone through 3 men in a parking structure to get to an elevator because his daughter was being born 3 floors above him, who had 11 stitches in his side and documentation ready for federal prosecutors that would dismantle everything he'd spent 20 years building. She looked at him. "I believe you," she said. She did not take him back. That was also true, and both things occupied the room simultaneously without contradiction. She held her daughter up slightly. Ji-taek reached for Zariah with the careful, almost frightened delicacy of a man handling something irreplaceable for the first time, hands that had navigated a parking fight 20 minutes ago now, holding 6 pounds of new person with a precision that came from somewhere beneath. Training, somewhere instinctive and fierce and entirely unpracticed. Zariah pressed her fist against his chest. He looked at her. Outside the hospital window, Chicago was beginning the first gray suggestion of morning over the lake. The city assembling itself again, the way it does every day, regardless of what happened inside any given room the night before, indifferent and continuous and exactly as large as it always was. A sound in the labor ward, On the fourth floor, a woman who had been summoned back to her own life, who had run through an alley and breathed through the worst night and pushed past every limit she thought she had, lay in the adjustable bed with the covers pulled to her waist and watched the man she was divorcing hold their daughter in the hospital light. Ji-taek looked up from Sori's face and found Zariah watching him. He said nothing. She said nothing. The monitor had been moved aside, and the room was quieter now, the particular quiet of a space after a tremendous thing has happened in it, when the urgency has passed and what remains is simply what is true. Sori breathed. Ji-taek held her with both hands and stood in the room with everything he had built, and everything he had destroyed, and everything he still owed, and arranged behind him like a landscape he had finally turned around to look at. And he understood in the particular irreversible way that you understand something, when it is standing in your arms, breathing, what a life actually costs, and what it is actually for. Zariah closed her eyes. She was tired in a way that went past the word tired, past any word she knew. She was tired, and she was present, and her daughter was in the room and alive and breathing. And in some months there would be a divorce finalized, and in some years there would be a house she chose, and a garden she planted, and a manuscript she wrote, and a child who would climb walls without being told she couldn't. All of that was coming. Right now there was only this room and this morning and her daughter's breath and the man standing at the edge of the bed, holding the most important thing either of them had ever made, standing in the wreckage of everything they'd been to each other, not restored and not forgiven, but present, accountable, and for the first time in 3 years telling the unmanaged truth. She did not take him back. She let him stay. The sun came up over Lake Michigan at 6:53 that morning, and nobody in the hospital was watching it. Zariah was asleep before the light reached the window of her room on the 4th floor. She had been gone. Before Drusilla finished pulling the blanket up, before the nurse dimmed the overhead, before the door had fully closed on the particular quiet of a room where something enormous has just finished happening. The sleep that took her was not restful, in any ordinary sense. It was the sleep of a body that has spent everything it had and is now doing the hard mechanical work of replenishment, the kind of sleep that has no dreams, because the mind has nothing left to build them from. Drusilla sat in the chair beside the bed. She had sent Ji-taek to the emergency department 30 minutes ago, with the tone she used in courtrooms when she was done accepting partial compliance, and he had gone because there was nothing left in the room that required his staying, and because Drusilla's tone was not something people argued with successfully. She sat now in the chair he had occupied and looked at her sister's face in the thin morning light and let herself feel the thing she had been holding back since Zariah had appeared in her doorway 4 months ago, soaking wet and done. It was not relief exactly. Relief implies the possibility of the worst outcome, and Drusilla had not permitted herself to consider the worst outcome because, considering, it would have put her somewhere she couldn't afford to be. What she felt now was something slower and more structural, the feeling of a weight being set down that you've been carrying so long. You stopped noticing it was there. The particular release of that. The strange lightness of a morning in which her sister was asleep in a hospital bed, and her niece was in a warmer down the hall, and the machinery that had been aimed at both of them was, as of midnight, broken and in federal custody. She put her reading glasses on. She pulled out her phone. She went back to work. Ji-taek sat in an examination room on the 2nd floor, while an emergency physician who had already put in 11 hours looked at the stitches in his left side with the careful attention of someone assessing another professional's work. Decent placement, the physician said. Tension's a little high on the 3rd one. She was working fast, Ji-taek said. You should have come down here 2 hours ago. I was occupied. The physician looked at him, at the dried blood on his shirt, at the stillness he carried, at the particular quality of a man who has been through multiple things tonight and is processing none of them yet because there isn't room. The physician had worked emergency medicine for 16 years. He had a practiced instinct for the difference between a person who was fine and a person who was managing. Baby healthy, he asked. Yes. You okay? Ji-taek looked at the wall across the room. A poster about hand washing, a diagram of the skeletal system. The ordinary infrastructure of a place where people come when their bodies have failed them. Ask me in a week, he said. The physician accepted this as a reasonable answer, and finished his assessment and gave Ji-taek the information about wound care and infection signs and follow-up that was his professional obligation to give. And Ji-taek listened to all of it with the attention of a man who has recently decided to start taking things seriously that he previously dismissed. He thanked the physician. He meant it. He went back upstairs. Crane arrived at the hospital at 8:15 with federal agent Soo-jin Park, who moved through the corridor with the organized efficiency of someone who has been awake since before the arrest and has too much left to do to acknowledge it. They used a family consultation room off the main corridor. Ji-taek sat across the table from them. Drusilla sat beside Ji-taek, not as his attorney, which she was explicitly not, and had told him so twice, but as the person in this building whose interests were Zariah's interests, which meant she was going to be present for everything said in this room, regardless of whether anyone invited her. Nobody had tried to uninvite her. Agent Park opened her folder on the table and looked at it for a moment before she looked up. Marek Veyron, she said, processed at midnight. Federal charges on 14 counts: racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, coercion of a protected witness, and 2 additional counts that the U.S. Attorney's Office added this morning based on documentation we received in the last 72 hours. She paused. Your documentation, Mr. Kwon. Ji-taek nodded. Han Sang-uk surrendered at O'Hare at approximately 11:45 last night. He's in custody. His attorney has already been in contact with the prosecution indicating intent to cooperate. Park's voice was entirely level. That decision came approximately 16 months too late to matter in the way he's hoping it will matter, but the prosecution will evaluate it. Ji-taek's jaw moved once. His hands were flat on the table. Evelina Rusk, Drusilla said. Park shifted her eyes to Drusilla. Apprehended at a private airstrip in Gary, Indiana at 2 a. She had a bag, a car, and a passport that was good enough to pass a casual inspection. A small pause. The inspection was not casual. And the 3 men from the parking structure, Drusilla said. 2 secured at the scene. 3rd apprehended on the adjacent street. All 3 connected to Marek's network through prior financial records and communications we already had. Park folded her hands on the folder. The network's financial infrastructure collapsed overnight. The asset freezes we've been preparing for 8 months executed at midnight. The shell companies, the holding entities, the intermediary accounts, all of them are frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. She looked at Ji-taek. That includes some entities connected to your organization as well. You were advised this would happen. I was advised, Ji-taek said. I'm not contesting it. Park studied him with the assessing quality of someone who has spent a career reading the difference between what people say and what they mean. You gave us everything, she said. Not a compliment. Just an observation about the scope of what had been provided. Yes, including documentation that directly implicates your own operations. Yes. Your attorney called my office 3 times last week, suggesting you might want to reconsider the scope of the disclosure. I know, I told him the scope stays. Park was quiet for a moment. She looked at the folder in front of her and then back at Ji-taek. I've been doing this work for 19 years, she said. I want to be direct with you because you've been direct with us, and I think you've earned that much. What you gave us is going to be the foundation of a federal case that takes Marek's network apart permanently. That has real value. The U.S. Attorney's Office knows it has real value. She paused. It does not erase what your organization did. It cannot. The legal process will reflect that. I understand, Ji-taek said. You're looking at federal charges. The cooperation will be considered. It will not be a clean outcome for you. I know what I'm looking at, Ji-taek said. I made the decision with full knowledge of what it costs. I'm not here to negotiate the cost down. Park looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, not warmth, exactly, but the thing that exists just before warmth in people who have learned to be careful with it. The acknowledgement of a person who has done something genuinely difficult, for reasons she finds, despite herself, credible. Okay, she said. She closed the folder. We'll be in contact with your legal representation within the week. She stood. Crane stood. Drusilla remained seated and looked at Park. My client is upstairs, Drusilla said. She's aware of everything discussed in this room through me. She doesn't need to be present for this. Understood, Park said. She was at the door when she stopped. She turned back, not looking at Ji-taek but at Drusilla. Tell her congratulations, Park said. On the baby. I will, Drusilla said. Park left. Crane paused in the doorway and looked at Ji-taek with the expression of a man who started this situation as Zariah's divorce attorney and has arrived at the end of it with a more complicated picture of everyone involved than he began with. You did the right thing, Crane said, belatedly. But you did it. Ji-taek looked at him without responding. Crane nodded and closed the door. Zariah woke at 9:47. The first sound she was aware of was a small, insistent sound from the direction of the door, the particular vocal register of a person who is awake and has identified a situation that requires comment. The nurse brought her in, and Zariah sat up and took her daughter and held her in the gray morning light and felt the night settle into its actual shape around her. Not the emergency of it, not the adrenaline, or the alley, or the vehicles, or the federal units closing from two directions. The actual shape of it, which was she was in a hospital room, in a city, holding a person she had made, and every piece of machinery that had been aimed at the two of them was broken. Drusilla was in the chair with coffee and her phone, and the working posture she maintained, regardless of circumstance. Ji-taek, Zariah said. Emergency department cleared him. He's in a consultation with Crane and Agent Park. Drusilla looked up. Marek is in custody, Song-uk is in custody, Evelina Rusk is in custody. The three men from the parking structure are in custody. Zariah looked at Sori's face. At the unfocused, serious attention Sori was directing at the light coming through the window. The network, Zariah said. Asset freezes executed overnight. Financial infrastructure collapsed. It'll work through the legal system for months, but the operational capacity is gone. Drusilla set down her phone. Park told Crane that Ji-taek's documentation was central. Her word was central. Zariah absorbed this. She thought about a phone on a counter. About all the layers beneath that, the ghost keycard, the shell companies, the 14 months of surveillance, the photographs sent to a woman to ensure she would comply with the destruction of someone else's marriage. All of it for market advantage. All of it pointed at a literacy program director on the south side of Chicago who taught 4-year-olds to sound out words. She looked at Sori. None of it touched you, she said quietly to her daughter, who did not understand the words but turned toward the sound of her voice with the complete, uncomplicated attention that newborns give to voices they already know. Ji-taek came to the room at 11. He knocked. Zariah said, "Come in." He came in carrying a stuffed rabbit from the hospital gift shop, brown, slightly lopsided, the kind of object that a person acquires when they are operating on no sleep in a building with limited options and genuine need. He looked at it briefly as he entered, as if reconsidering the choice, and then looked at Zariah and decided not to overthink it. He set the rabbit at the foot of the bed. He looked at Sori on Zariah's chest. Drusilla gathered her things without being asked and said she was getting more coffee and left the room with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly when a room needs fewer people in it. Ji-taek sat in the chair. For a moment they just looked at Sori together. Sori was looking at the window. The window had the particular quality of light that rooms on the east side of buildings have, in the late morning, angled and specific, making ordinary things look considered. Agent Park, Zariah said. She was here, we spoke. And the process starts this week. My attorneys will be contacted. He kept his voice even. I told her I'm not contesting anything, and I'm not changing the scope of the disclosure. She understood. Zariah looked at Sori. It's going to be public. Yes, everything. Yes, he paused. I know what that means. I've known what it means for 3 months. I'm not going to waste your time performing uncertainty I don't have about it. She looked at him. How long, she said. He held her eyes. I don't know yet. The cooperation will be considered. But the charges are real and the outcome will be real. He paused. I'm not going to fight it. I told Park that, and I'm telling you. Why, she said. The question landed, and he sat with it for a moment. Because fighting it would mean using resources and relationships that belong to the organization, he said. And the organization is done. I'm not going to use the wreckage of it to protect myself from the consequences of having built it. He looked at Sori. And because he started again. I have spent 20 years in rooms where I was the person decided what was just. I've been wrong about that my entire career. I'm going to let someone else make that determination this time. Zariah was quiet. What she needs, she said after a moment. When you come out of whatever comes next, what she needs is not your name or your money or the infrastructure you built to protect things you cared about. She needs a father who keeps his word. That's the entire thing. I know, he said. I'm not saying it so you'll agree with me. I'm saying it so that in 2 years or 5 years or however long it is, when the instinct to manage and to decide and it will come back, that's who you are. You have this moment to go back to. I said it clearly and you heard it. He looked at her. I heard it, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. The man who had decided what she was allowed to know and called it love. Who had stood in a parking structure with 3 men between him and his daughter and gone through them because the elevator was on the other side. Who had given federal prosecutors the information that would dismantle his own empire and made that decision without negotiating the outcome. She believed him. She did not take him back. Both things were simultaneously and completely true, and she was done, pretending they required resolution. She lifted Sori slightly. Ji-taek reached for his daughter. He held her with the careful, almost frightened precision of a man who has spent his adult life handling dangerous things and has just been handed the only thing in his life that he cannot afford to drop. His hands, the hands that had navigated a parking structure fight 2 hours ago, held her with a delicacy that was not practiced and was not performed. Sori pressed her fist against his chest. He looked at her fist. He looked at her face, and something in him, the last piece of the scaffolding, the last of the managed, deliberate architecture of a man who had spent 20 years deciding never to be undone, came apart without drama. Not loudly, just quietly, in the particular way that things which have been holding under pressure for a very long time finally release, releasing not with a collapse, but with a settling, the way a structure finds its actual resting position after the false supports are removed. He stood in the morning light and held his daughter and was, for the first time in his adult life, entirely without armor. Zariah watched him. She did not look away. The sentencing happened on a Tuesday in April. Zariah was at the literacy center. She had thought about whether to attend the hearing. She had sat with the question for 2 weeks, not because she didn't know her own answer, but because she wanted to make sure the answer came from a place she could stand behind. Not from anger or from the desire to watch consequence arrive for someone who had caused her harm. She was done making decisions from those places. She was not going. The Literacy Center had a Tuesday morning group at 9-7 kids, 4 to 6 years old, at various stages of the long, irregular adventure of learning to read. She sat in the circles of small chairs with them and read from a book about a bear who builds something very large. Tears it down and builds it again differently. The kids had strong opinions about the bear's first design. One of them said the bear was stupid. Another said the bear was brave. A third said the bear was stupid and brave, which Zariah thought was probably the most accurate assessment she was going to hear all day. Crane called it 2:15. She stepped into the hallway. 22 months, he said, federal custody. He accepted without appeal. Grounds for a challenge existed, and he declined to pursue them. Zariah stood in the hallway and looked at the wall across from her. A drawing one of the kids had made and taped up a house, a sun with a face, 3 people with enormous hands. The ordinary art of a child who has not yet learned that suns don't have faces, which meant she still had the information that they might. 22 months, Zariah said. Yes. Custody arrangement carries through. Yes. Saturday calls remain as scheduled. The trust administration continues under independent oversight. The security arrangements stay under your authority. She pressed the back of her hand against the wall. The plaster was cold and solid. Is he all right? She asked. She heard the question come out of her mouth and felt the complicated truth of why she was asking it, which was not simple and was not purely pragmatic, but was the honest thing she actually wanted to know. Crane paused. He was calm in the courtroom. His attorney described him as prepared. Okay, she said. She went back inside and finished the afternoon. She went to the house near Lake Michigan on a Wednesday, in February. She had looked at 11 properties. She had stood in the kitchen of this one for 30 seconds in the morning light and told the realtor she would take it, and the realtor had been surprised by the speed of the decision, and Zariah had not explained it, because it was not the kind of thing you explain, it was the kind of thing you recognize. The lease was signed at Crane's office. She drove to the house afterward and sat in the parked car in front of it for a moment, before going in. It was a mid-century brick, 2-story on a block of similar houses. The front yard had made a decision about grass, and the decision was no. The kitchen faced east. The back garden was the particular kind of neglected that means someone once cared about it deeply, and then circumstances had changed, and what remained was potential organized under dead material. She got out of the car. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen in the late afternoon light and looked at the room that was hers. Her cabinets, her window, her walls, and felt something shift in her chest that was not dramatic and was not a revelation, but was something she had been moving toward for 4 months, a weight finally finding the right surface to rest on. She went back to the car and got Sori from the carrier and brought her in. They stood in the empty kitchen together, Sori in her arms, and Zariah said, "This is ours." Sori looked at the ceiling with the focused interest she brought to all new environments. "Ours," Zariah said again, to herself more than to her daughter. Drusilla came the first Saturday. They unpacked until 2 in the morning, moving things between rooms and arguing with the low-grade amiability of sisters who disagree about the placement of objects, but agree about what matters. The kitchen became the base of operations. Tea was made and got cold twice. Splot scene. At some point past midnight, they both ended up sitting on the kitchen floor because there were no chairs yet, and the floor was where they'd ended up. Drusilla looked around at the partially unpacked state of the kitchen. "You good?" she asked. Zariah thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yeah," she said. "Not everything resolved and done. Not that. But yeah, in the sense of I'm here. I'm in my kitchen. Sori's upstairs. I know what I'm doing tomorrow." Drusilla looked at her for a moment. "Okay," she said. Okay, I see you and I believe you, and that's enough." They sat on the kitchen floor until Sori woke at 3:15, and Zariah went upstairs, and Drusilla let herself out. And Zariah stood in the dark room that would be Sori's, and held her daughter, and listened to the new house settle around them. Learning its particular language of pipes and floorboards and radiators, and felt more herself than she had felt in longer than she could accurately measure. Ji-taek called every Saturday at 10 in the morning. From the first call he was there on time. Zariah would set the tablet on the kitchen table and hold Sori in her lap, and Ji-taek's face would appear on the screen, and for the allotted time, he would attempt to read to a person who was, for the first several months, not yet physiologically equipped to follow a narrative, but was genuinely interested in faces and voices, and the phenomenon of someone on the other side of a screen behaving with focused attention in her direction. He was not good at it. He held books at wrong angles. He lost his place. He used the same flat cadence for every character, which was the cadence of a man who has spent his adult life, ensuring his voice carried authority, and has not previously had occasion to make a duck sound differently than a lion. Zariah watched from the other side of the kitchen and said nothing. He kept showing up every Saturday at 10. Month by month, the reading got less bad. He learned which books made Sori's eyes track the pages, and which ones lost her to the more interesting business of her own hands. He learned that she responded when something unexpected happened, a fall, a reversal, the particular comedy of plans going wrong in ways that are survivable. He started trying voices. The first time he did the voice for the bear, in the book they'd been reading for 3 weeks, a low, aggrieved, slightly ridiculous sound. Sori grabbed the edge of the tablet and laughed, sudden and total, and Ji-taek top and loved daughter laughing of it. And then did it again, and she laughed again, and he did it a third time. And each time she laughed, like it was the first time, which is the specific generosity of children who have not yet learned to ration their delight. Zariah put her coffee down and watched her daughter laugh at her father's voice. She did not perform any particular feeling about it. She just watched. He was showing up. Every Saturday at 10, getting it wrong, trying again, showing up. That was the thing she had asked for. That was the thing she was measuring everything against. He was passing the measurement. The manuscript began as the private notebook she had started in February, the ongoing written conversation with her own experience that she had developed as a practice, because she had spent too many years not keeping track of her own interior, and she was not going to continue that particular oversight. Sound green wood splitting. Somewhere in the fall, she would sit at the kitchen table after Sori was asleep. She had chairs by then, and a table from an estate sale that had required 3 people to get through the front door, and a window box of herbs that were surviving against the available light, and she would write for an hour, sometimes 2, and what came out was not quite personal narrative, and not quite argument, but some third thing that lived between them. It was about the specific confusion of love and control, how they can look identical from the inside, how they are built from the same raw materials of attention and protection and wanting to keep safe things that matter, and how the difference between them is not in the origin but in the practice, in whether the person being protected is allowed to know they are being protected and allowed to refuse, allowed to define for themselves what safe looks like. She wrote about what it costs to live inside the confusion for a long time, what it takes from a person, what remains when it's over, and you are standing in the aftermath trying to inventory your own self and identify which parts are actually yours, and which parts were constructed around the shape of someone else's idea of who you were supposed to be. She wrote about what it is to rebuild. She showed it to Drusilla on a Sunday in November at the kitchen table, with Sori asleep and tea going cold, and Drusilla reading with the particular stillness she brought to things that mattered. When she finished, she set the pages down. She looked at Zariah across the table. "This is going to reach people," she said, in places they weren't expecting. "I'm not trying to reach people," Zariah said. "I'm trying to tell the truth about something that happened to me." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Drusilla said. "The truth about one woman's specific experience is also often the truth about a lot of people's experience. That's why literature exists." She paused. "Send it somewhere. It exposes a woman who made choices and survived them, and learned something worth saying." Drusilla's voice was clear and final. "The people it's most directly about have done the things they did. You haven't exaggerated anything. You haven't made anyone into a villain they weren't, and you've been generous where generosity was arguably not required." Zariah looked at the manuscript on the table. "It's not about revenge," she said. "I need to be clear about that." "I know it's not," Drusilla said. "That's precisely why you should send it. Revenge would have been easier to write and less useful to anyone who reads it." Ji-taek was released on a Thursday in February, 22 months from the sentencing. Zariah noted the date from Crane and made no plans around it. She went to the literacy center. She ran the morning session. She had a budget meeting in the afternoon that ran long, because the new teacher she'd been able to hire, with the grant funding, had strong opinions about resource allocation that Zariah mostly agreed with, and they went through the numbers twice to make sure they were right. She drove home in the early evening. Ji-taek called after dinner. His number was still in her phone. She had never deleted it, which was not sentiment but accuracy. You keep the numbers of people who will remain in your life in specific, defined ways, and he was going to remain in her life in specific, defined ways for as long as Sori needed him to. She answered. "I'm out," he said. "I know," she said. A pause in which both of them sat with what that sentence contained. "I'd like to ask about in-person visits," he said. "I'm asking you directly, not through the attorneys." She had already thought about it. She had been thinking about it for 3 months, not in the abstract, but specifically what the conditions needed to be, what she needed to be able to guarantee. But she put her daughter in a physical space with this man and allowed the relationship between them to take on a dimension that a tablet screen cannot fully provide, which was the dimension of actual presence, of someone who is in the room and smells like a specific person and has hands that are the hands of your father and not just a face on a screen. She told him the conditions. She said each one clearly, without softening, without preamble. Location of her choosing, duration she set. Drusilla present for the first 3 months. No variation from agreed schedules without 48 hours advance notice. No contact with Sori outside arranged visits without her prior approval. She said each condition and waited. "Yes," he said to each one. not performing compliance, not managing her toward an outcome. Just yes, I agree. Those are the conditions and I accept them. She's talking, Zariah said, when the last condition had been confirmed. Single words. She's very committed to no. Her current best word is more. A silence. Something in his voice when he spoke had the quality of a man who has been holding himself at a particular emotional distance for 22 months and has just felt that distance close by 1 degree. Not dramatically, just perceptibly. That sounds like her, he said. I thought you should know before you see her, Zariah said. It lands differently in person than through a screen. Yes, he said. Thank you. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table in the February dark. The heat moved through the radiators with the reliable, knocking language of a house that had been doing this for decades. The window above the sink showed the alley behind the house, lit by a single exterior light that turned the February night a particular shade of amber. She sat and thought about what 22 months had cost everyone in this story. The number itself was abstract until you placed it alongside specific things. Sori had gone from 4 pounds of new person to a child who said no with conviction and climbed onto chairs and had opinions about which books contained adequate bears. 22 months of that. 22 months of Saturday screens and bare voices and catching up from a distance to the specific irreversible dailiness of a child growing up. She thought about Song-uk in federal custody, serving a sentence longer than Ji-taek's because his cooperation came late and his betrayal was complete. She thought about Marek Veyron in a federal facility. The financial architecture he'd spent a decade building collapsed into seized assets and criminal charges. She thought about Evelina Rusk and the 3 men from the parking structure and all the apparatus that had been pointed at her life. She thought about Sabine, somewhere in federal protection, with Celine and the girls living under a name she had chosen instead of the one that had been used against her. She thought about all of it, and felt not the satisfaction of winning. Winning was not the word for any of this, but something more like accuracy. The sense of things having arrived at their actual positions. The world being, for once, the shape it was supposed to be. She went to bed. She slept without difficulty for the first time in longer than she could track. Sabine's message arrived on a Thursday in May, mid-morning, while Zariah was in a planning meeting at the Literacy Center. She excused herself and read it in the hallway. 4 sentences. She read them twice. The federal placement was done. Celine and the girls were safe. The literacy grant had been approved. Sabine had been in contact with the review board and had argued for it. She knew it didn't balance anything. Zariah stood in the hallway with her back against the wall and held the phone and thought about a woman in a bedroom with a glass of wine, saying words that had been selected with surgical precision to cause maximum damage. She thought about that same woman standing in Drusilla's hallway in the worst hour of the worst night, holding an envelope of evidence and saying the names of her nieces carefully, Noelle and Margot, like she was setting them somewhere safe. She thought about what it means to understand a thing fully and still not be able to let it back into your life. She typed one word, received. She put the phone in her pocket and went back into the meeting. She never responded to another message from that number. Not from cruelty and not from punishment. From the clear, honest recognition that understanding circumstances and continuing a relationship with them are 2 entirely separate decisions, and she had made her decision, and it was enough. The grant existed. The girls were safe. Sabine had done one last thing that cost her something and asked nothing in return. That was the shape of it, and the shape was complete. The first in-person visit happened on a Saturday in March, at a park near the lake that Zariah chose because she knew every exit and had sat on its benches enough times to know exactly where the light fell in the late afternoon. She sat on the central bench with Sori in her lap. Drusilla sat on the adjacent bench with a brief she was theoretically reading and was actually using as a prop for being present without hovering. Ji-taek arrived on time. He looked different. Not diminished, that was not the right word, but edited. Something removed that had been present before. The specific density that powerful men carry in their bodies, the accumulated weight of rooms in which they were the person everyone was watching, the unconscious physical grammar of someone who has spent 20 years being the most consequential person in any given space. It wasn't gone, it was quieter, sitting differently, like a coat he'd put back on, and wasn't yet sure still fit him exactly right. He sat beside Zariah on the bench. Sori looked at him. She had seen his face on a screen for 22 months. She looked at him now in person with the focused, unfiltered assessment of a child who has not yet developed the social instinct to manage her own reactions, which meant she was simply looking at him with everything she had. Ji-taek sat very still under the assessment. He let her look. Sori reached out and put her hand on his knee. She patted it twice with the decisive rhythm of someone conducting an investigation and arriving at a conclusion. Then she looked at Zariah, checking. "That's your dad," Zariah said. Sori looked back at Ji-taek. Ji-taek looked at his daughter's hand on his knee. At her face. At the specific, particular, completely individual person that had been in a hospital room 22 months ago and had not yet been this person, who said no and climbed chairs and had opinions about bears. "Hi, Sori," he said, quietly, carefully, the voice of a man who is aware that he is speaking to someone who is deciding what he means to her. Sori said with total authority, "No." Then she patted his knee again. Ji-taek made a sound the one Zariah had first heard through a tablet screen when Sori laughed at the bear voice, the involuntary, genuine, entirely unmanaged sound of a man being surprised by his own delight. He made the sound and Sori looked at him with great interest, determining what effect she had produced. She improved not, and whether she approved of it. She appeared to approve. Drusilla turned a page of her brief with great dignity. Zariah watched her daughter and her former husband on a bench in the March light and did not perform any particular feeling about it. She let it be what it was, which was complicated and real and not reducible to any single emotion, which was how most things worth having actually felt. Summer came, and the garden became what she had seen it could be. She had not done it alone or perfectly. She had killed a tomato plant through overwatering and had a conversation about it with the man from 2 streets over, who was scrupulously honest about the fact that she had done it wrong and equally honest about the fact that it was fixable. She had replanted. The fruit trees produced more apricots than she had planned for, which turned out to be a problem with a straightforward solution. She brought the surplus to the literacy center, and the kids ate them at snack time and conducted a debate about whether apricots were better than plums, that Zariah judged privately to be among the more rigorous intellectual exchanges she had witnessed. She submitted the manuscript in July. She had an offer in October. The editor's note that came with the offer said, among other things, "This is the clearest account I have read of the specific confusion between protection and control. It is going to reach people in places they did not know they were carrying something unexamined." Zariah read the note at the kitchen table. She sat with it for a few minutes. Then she signed the contract and slid it into the return envelope and put it by the door to mail in the morning and went to get Sori out of the high chair where she was finishing dinner with the systematic approach she brought to all meals. Sori held up a piece of fruit. "More," she said. "That is literally the last piece," Zariah said. Sori considered this. "No," she said, and ate it. Sori was 4 years old when she climbed the garden wall. The visit was the first Saturday of August. The garden was fully itself. By then the raised beds organized and producing, the fruit trees properly shaped, the stone wall repointed and solid along the back, exactly 3.5 feet of mortared stone that had been there since before Zariah moved in and would be there after. Ji-taek Kwon was in one of the chairs near the back beds. He had been coming for 5 months. The visits had their own rhythm now, established through repetition and the absence of catastrophe, Sori leading him through the garden, with the authority of the person who lived there, explaining things to him with the confidence of someone who may or may not be accurate, but is entirely committed. He listened to everything she said. He asked her questions. He was better at listening than Zariah had expected, which she noted and did not make into anything larger than what it was. Sori moved through the garden with the proprietary ease of a child in her own territory. She showed Ji-taek the tomatoes. She identified an earthworm with operatic enthusiasm. She explained that the bird in the apricot tree was definitely named Gerald and had been named Gerald for a long time. Then she walked to the stone wall. She looked at it. She put her hands on it. Ji-taek came out of his chair. The movement was complete and reflexive, weight forward, hands rising, the instinct of a man who has spent his entire adult life preventing things from going wrong preemptively. He was 3 steps toward her before he caught himself. He stopped. He looked across the garden at Zariah. Zariah had moved too, also stopped. They stood on either side of the garden, the two of them, the parents of this child, both with the same caught impulse. The sound moment, both having pulled back from it at the same moment, and they looked at each other across the space where their daughter was beginning to climb. Neither of them spoke. Sori found a gap in the stone with her right foot, found the edge at the top with both hands. Her arms shook with the effort. She was 4 years old, and the wall was 3.5 feet, and those two facts were in a genuine negotiation. She slipped. She fell back onto the grass, landing the way small children land, absorbing the impact through her whole body, sitting in it, uninjured. She sat on the grass and looked at the wall. Ji-taek's hands closed. Zariah watched her daughter. Sori stood up. She walked back to the wall and put her hands on it and started again. This time she had the information from the first attempt, the location of the better foothold, the angle of approach, how much of her weight the grip at the top could manage before it failed. She was 4 years old, and she was conducting an empirical inquiry into a physics problem, and she was not interested in assistance. She found the foothold. She found the grip. Her arms shook. She did not slip. She reached the top of the wall and straightened up and stood there with both arms raised, wide open, her whole body a single declaration of accomplished fact. Her face wearing the expression of someone who was not surprised by this outcome because she had decided it would happen. Ji-taek laughed. The real laugh, the one with no management in it, the one that came from somewhere below the place where management operates, the one that Zariah had heard for the first time through a tablet screen when Sori laughed at the bare voice, and that she had been hearing, on and off, for 22 months. He laughed like a man who has just witnessed something that moved him past the ability to be careful about it, and the laughter was full and unguarded and entirely real. Zariah laughed too. She stood in her garden in the August afternoon and laughed at her daughter on top of the wall and felt it move through her chest with the quality of something that is simply true. Not performed toward anyone, not constructed for any purpose. Just present because it was the natural response to this particular moment, which was her daughter on a wall she had climbed herself, with both arms up, in a garden that was theirs. Sori looked down at both of them from the top of the wall. She assessed their reaction with the seriousness of a performer evaluating her audience. She appeared to find it adequate. Then she looked at the other side of the wall. The neighbor's yard, the unknown territory on the far side of the boundary. She looked at it for a moment with genuine consideration. Then she looked back at her parents. No, she said, with the finality of someone who has made a decision after appropriate reflection. She turned around and climbed back down. Ji-taek left at the end of the visit, and Sori went inside, and Zariah stood alone in the garden in the last of the afternoon light. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She was standing in her garden in August, and the light was doing the specific thing it does in late sunset summer, coming from low and to the side, making everything look like it has been lit from within, and she was letting herself be in it without directing the experience toward any conclusion. She looked at the wall. She thought about a Tuesday in November, a phone on a counter, an elevator closing, a door opening wider. She thought about all the distance between that morning and this afternoon, not chronological distance, but the interior kind, the distance between who she had been in that elevator and who she was standing in this garden, which was not a simple distance and was not a journey with a clear arc, but was real and had been walked and was hers. She thought about 22 months of Saturday mornings, about a man learning to do a bare voice badly enough to make his daughter laugh, about what it means to show up for something you have no right to expect, repeatedly, without negotiating the terms, back in your own direction. She thought about the book that would be published in the spring, about all the people who would open it and find in it something they had been living without language for, about what it means to put the truth of your own experience into words and release it into the world and allow it to become something that belongs to people you will never meet. She looked at the wall. Her daughter had climbed it, had fallen, had climbed it again with the information from the falling, had reached the top. That was the whole story, really. That was the shape of it, underneath all the other shapes. You fall and you get up with what you learned from the falling and you try again differently. And if you are not told you cannot do it, if no one decides for you what your capabilities are and what you are allowed to attempt, you reach the top. You raise both arms. Inside the house, Sori was making the noise of a child who has had a large afternoon and is now processing it through her entire body. The noise was specific and enthusiastic and entirely her own. Zariah turned away from the garden. She went inside. Her daughter was in the middle of the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon and the lid from a pot and a theory about percussion. She looked up when Zariah came through the door and held up the spoon with the expression of some sharing important breaking news. Loud, Sori said. Very loud, Zariah confirmed. She sat on the kitchen floor beside her daughter, and Sori demonstrated the loud again with full commitment, and Zariah put her hands over her ears with exaggerated effect. And Sori laughed the way she laughed with her whole body, without reservation, with the complete absence of self-consciousness that belongs only to children who have not yet been told. There is a correct amount of joy for a given situation. Came through the kitchen window at its late afternoon angle, the same light that fell on the garden and the wall and everything that had been tended back into shape. Outside, the garden held what it had been given. The wall stood where it had always stood. The fruit trees kept the shape they had been pruned back to. The raised beds waited for whatever came next. And in the kitchen on the floor, in a house near Lake Michigan that belonged entirely to the person who lived in it, Zariah Monroe sat with her daughter and let the noise fill every corner of the room without once considering whether it was too much, without once looking around to see who was listening, without once thinking about whether she was allowed. She was allowed. She had always been allowed. It had taken everything she had to arrive at a life in which she actually knew that. And now she knew it, and the knowing was hers. And nobody, not the man she had married, not the woman who had been placed in her bedroom, not the lieutenant who had sold them all for money, not the strategist who had aimed an entire criminal network at a children's literacy program on the south side of Chicago. Nobody was going to take it from her. Not today, not ever. Sori banged the spoon against the lid. The sound filled the kitchen. Zariah laughed.